Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. 6 months ago, I did a video called WTF is Invisigun Heroes. I stated during that video that it was probably one of the best games I'd played all year, incredibly innovative, extremely fun, and a very likely candidate for my top 10 of 2017. That video received 175,000 views. The unofficial livestream VOD for the Invisigun playthrough with Jesse Cox, Invicta, and Slowbeef received 86,000 views. Over the course of the last 6 months, the game has been played by popular YouTubers such as Jesse Cox, Dodger, the incredibly popular Let's Play channel featuring Achievement Hunter, and various other smaller channels and streamers. Over those 6 months, the game has sold, according to Steam Spy, a grand total of 7,500 copies. This includes the 500 or so copies that we sold as part of a promo deal on chrono.gg/tb, which is our partner website. I didn't want to make this video until after that deal was done, since I'd most likely be accused of shilling for a game that I would be receiving money for. Since that is no longer on sale and no longer the case, that isn't really a problem. But what that has demonstrated quite firmly is, despite the fact that everybody that played it really seemed to enjoy it, we had an absolute blast on stream. That was very clearly evident, and I gave it the highest recommendation I really could have possibly given it. The game has barely shifted any units. You gotta scratch your head and think, why is that? Despite the fact that it has collectively over 1 million views on YouTube through various videos and it's had a lot of stream attention, the game just hasn't sold. And you gotta look and think, well, why? Was it a price point issue? Doesn't seem to be. The game sold for $15, which frankly is not a particularly high price. Was it an issue of not having online multiplayer? No, the game has online multiplayer, and frankly the online multiplayer is very functional and has a wide variety of useful additions which allow for both matchmaking and playing with friends. Was it a lack of a demo? Well, no. The game has Invisigun Heroes Guest Edition, which allows you to download a demo and play with those that own the game, simply via a download link on Steam. At this point, you start to dig into more and more absurd reasons. Was it down to a lack of mentions on the Steam curator page? Possibly, but I think we all know at this point that Steam curation has very little impact, although I was by far the largest curator to feature it, by a difference of about 750,000 followers. Was it down to a simple lack of character and identity? I don't think so. It may very well have a pixel art style, but it's frankly a very stylish one with a great use of effects and a very nice roster of characters with plenty of distinct design work put into each, all with unique abilities and a wide variety of interesting and amusing taunts. Was it due to a lack of good trailer? I don't think so. Once again, I think the trailer did a fairly reasonable job, but it does show one glaring problem. It wasn't down to a lack of content. The game has over 50 maps in it. It wasn't down to a lack of modes. It has 7 modes playable on every map in the game. It wasn't down to a lack of heroes. There are 8 of them, each with unique abilities and visual appearances. And as I mentioned, it certainly wasn't down to multiplayer functionality because both local, online, and even cross-platform multiplayer are supported. It has feature after feature after feature, including even the ability to export GIFs of funny plays, and a great soundtrack as well. So what is wrong with the trailer? It's a simple visibility problem. This is a game where the whole point is that you are only visible when you shoot. It's a very intriguing idea. It sets up an incredibly tense arena battle in which situational awareness is key and risk-reward is a defining aspect of each matchup. You must pay attention to areas of the terrain for indications of where not only the enemy heroes are, but also your own. You have to try and count your steps to ensure that you don't run into things and reveal your position. And of course, you don't know where you are until you yourself shoot, so using your gun to both attack and also to reveal your location in the process is a very unique and interesting trade-off. And yet here is the fairly obvious problem. With invisible characters, staying invisible for maybe 90% of the match, possibly even longer than that, it is nigh on impossible to communicate the enjoyment of the game through to a viewer on YouTube or on Twitch. We had an interesting mixed reaction when we played Invisigun. When it came to streaming it on my channel initially, the game was quite popular, and the chat really seemed to enjoy the aspect of trying to keep an eye on the map to figure out where everybody was. But when it was demonstrated to the audience of the Northern Lions Super Show, the audience generally panned it, for the reason that I just gave. They couldn't see what was going on. This ended up with a very interesting split of opinion, and the developer put in a very awkward position. How exactly do we demonstrate to the viewer what a fun game this is? How do we communicate that information across when the whole point is that everybody's invisible, including the player? Is that even possible to do? What is the technical solution? Is it even right to communicate the positions of the players to the viewers? Because as I mentioned before, some of the viewers actually enjoyed the experience of trying to keep an eye on the map and hunting for the different players. Well, the answer occurred quite recently, and you can see the results on the screen right now. The developer implemented a streamer mode which launched a second version of the game. This version of the game is a spectator client, and bearing in mind the game requires very little in terms of CPU power as a pixel art top-down party game, it was very easy to create this second client and have them join as a spectator. The spectator is able to see outlines of the characters, and streamers and YouTubers are able to capture from that second spectator source rather than their player window. You might think to yourself, well, hey, that surely gives an advantage to the streamer. They can see where everybody is. Well, that's not true. In public matches, there's a 2-second delay, which completely throws you off, and even in private matches where there is no delay between the spectator mode and the regular mode, what they've done is they have flipped the map around, making it nigh on impossible to figure out where anybody is simply by glancing at it. You need a pretty specially wired brain, I think, to be able to figure that one out, and I took one glance at it and said, nope. There is no way in a million years that I can figure out where anybody is in real time by looking at a flipped version of the map. As a result, the stream spectators were able to enjoy a pretty cool, unique experience where they saw exactly where the streamers were, and the streamers had no idea. And it resulted in some pretty riotous streaming over the course of a couple of hours. I would recommend that you watch the whole VOD. I've linked it in the description below. You can watch the whole lot on the unofficial stream channel, and you can see exactly how much screaming, how much shouting, and how much action was going on. To say that I had a whale of a time would be an understatement. When I made the remark 6 months ago that this was very likely to be on my Game of the Year list, it's still going to be. It's highly likely it'll be in my top 10 unless somehow we see 10 better games come out in the next 6 months, which doesn't seem particularly likely at all, really, does it? And the viewers themselves also had a great time, although some did complain that they would have preferred to see the original version, which indicates once again that nice interesting split. So what the developer basically did was a very similar technique to the rise of televised poker tournaments. Poker was not a particularly popular televised event, right up until one particular innovation. The camera which showed you the hands of the players, usually by affixing the camera under a glass table. The hands went face down, the cameras could very clearly see them, and then of course the hands were put up on the screen using computer graphics. This allowed for a very unique sense of asymmetry. The viewers got to know more than the players, and a lot of the tension and enjoyment came from this informational asymmetry between the viewer and the player. The tension came from there, the excitement, the thrills, and it's become extremely popular over the last few years. Televised poker is attracting viewership in the millions as a direct result of that addition. Does that apply to Invisigun Heroes? Well, I think it very much does. Communicating that idea across to the viewers is very important. Being able to communicate the soul of a game That is an incredibly vital part of being a curator, a influencer, and an agent of discovery when it comes to video games or indeed any form of media. If you're able to express your passion and why you find a game exciting, generally speaking, that allows the viewer to understand that concept, but that has to be accompanied by appropriate visual aids. And when those heroes are invisible, how could you possibly expect to be able to successfully do that? Nobody can. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter if you're as entertaining as Let's Play or, well, you know what, I'm not going to compliment myself, but you get the idea. Now, this brings me on to the wider consequences of poor visibility when it comes to video games in the modern era. With the advent of streaming and YouTube, it's becoming increasingly important to create games with the notion of streaming and visibility and watchability, viewability. I don't like those words, they don't sound like real words, but you certainly get the idea. You've got to bear in mind the potential audience, because it is entirely possible that your game's success will be driven in a large part by that audience. Indeed, on the flip side, the game may very well be doomed by it, if you're not careful. If you want two polar opposite examples of games that have both succeeded and failed utterly as a direct result of how watchable they are, you look at the success of PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. You look at just how important streamers have been to that success, and how watchable and entertaining a game that genuinely is. And then you look at Battleborn. Battleborn was a game with a lot of problems. Battleborn was by no means perfect. Battleborn was sent out to die. Unlike the prediction of industry analyst Michael Pachter when it came to Gearbox's Borderlands title, Battleborn was the true game being sent out to die. Battleborn did not stand a chance, and some of that was self-inflicted. Having spoken to many of my streaming colleagues and those that create content for YouTube, there is one consistent opinion amongst every single one of those people. Battleborn on launch was a riotous, overly colorful, indistinguishable mess when it came to watchability and viewability on YouTube and on stream. There are a wide variety of different reasons. For instance, an overuse of the color red. You might think, well, what does that mean? Why is that even relevant? Well, you may have noticed, particularly on YouTube, that YouTube doesn't really like the color red very much. You will notice a greater deal of what's called artifacting, or to put it in simpler terms, blockier, blurrier outputs on YouTube videos when it comes to the color red versus any other color. And that's just part of the encoding process. That's just part of the codec. I couldn't explain to you why, but it is a fact. It is part of the reality. So if you are designing a game that you want people to enjoy the viewing experience of on YouTube, or even making a video, you should, where possible, avoid a lot of the color red, especially when the color red is in motion. Combined with that, you had an insane amount of particle effects, huge amounts of very, very visually upfront and frankly obnoxious effects that obstructed the view of both the player and the viewer. A player can deal with them because a player is in control of the character and perhaps experience with the game. A viewer has no idea what is going on as a direct result of that. The games that are generally successful when it comes to the viewing experience, whether it be YouTube or indeed streaming, are usually those with solid visual clarity. Overwatch is currently suffering some issues with the numbers of spectators, simply down to how difficult that game can be to watch. Of personal experience, I've actually visited the TBS studio down in Atlanta when they were doing the Overwatch finals, and even after hundreds of hours of Overwatch play, I had difficulty telling what was going on. You compare that when it comes to first-person shooters to something with the incredibly crisp visual clarity of Counter-Strike Go, and you can clearly see the difference. CSGO had years to get better when it came to spectator mode, and it put in a great deal of useful information and innovation, such as, for instance, player outlines for spectators but not for players, and the idea of filling up that player silhouette and outline with a solid color as the player took damage. It offers immediate, obvious visual feedback to anyone that's even not particularly familiar with the game at all. I find CSGO to be a very watchable game as a result. Dota, in particular, I think is quite watchable as well. There is a lower number of abilities going off than most other games in the genre, and those abilities tend to have a lot of impact and a lot of visual clarity. Now, earlier in its lifespan, I would have said that League of Legends suffered from a lack of visual clarity and what I would have described appropriately as a color riot. However, having watched more recent events, I find it easier to tell what is going on and which abilities are being used as a result of some reworks when it came to how some of the abilities was presented to the viewer. Games that have failed to provide this visual clarity have, as a result, often failed to gain traction on streaming sites. The behavior of streamers is often dictated by the desires of their audience. The audience will make it abundantly clear if they don't like watching a particular game or a particular type of game, and usually that will influence the decision of the streamer because they will see numbers go down, and naturally you want to stream the things that your audience wants to see. Now, you don't want to have your career completely dictated by the audience. That essentially makes you a slave to them. But you will more often than not be discouraged from playing a particular type of game if the audience is not responding well to it. There are far more aspects at play than simply visual clarity when it comes to the watchability of a game on YouTube or indeed on Twitch. When it comes to Twitch in particular, we see that many people are still watching Hearthstone years on because the experience of watching a player play Hearthstone is almost that of shared suffering. It's the concept that if you've played Hearthstone, you understand what it's like to get screwed over. You understand what it's like to roll a 1 on a d20. You understand what it's like for the enemy to pull out some ridiculous RNG BS and suddenly you lose the game to it. That level of sympathy, and also the experience of watching somebody else suffer, as bizarre as it sounds, as frankly sadistic as it sounds, is actually a very enjoyable feeling. Regardless of that, though, there is always one aspect tying all of these games together. That's visual clarity. The ability to communicate the heart and soul and essence of a game simply by watching it. In an ideal scenario, there should need to be no commentary accompanying the footage in order to show somebody why something is awesome, why something is worth their time, and of course the investment of their hard-earned money. If you as a game developer fail to do that, well, you have seen the results. It often doesn't matter how good your game is. It doesn't matter how innovative. It doesn't matter how interesting and how original. People are not going to buy it. We're in a world of excessive choice. We are spoiled for choice on every possible level when it comes to games. We are drowned in huge numbers of both good and bad. We're in a situation where, frankly, nobody, not even the most well-funded website with huge numbers of staff members, can even come close to covering all of the worthwhile material that ends up on Steam. And that's not to even mention the stuff that's bad and that we actually need to warn some people about. A small number of you may remember a mention only a few years ago now of a site called The Home of the Underdogs, the concept of abandonware, games that were no longer available on sale and had been uploaded to this website to try and preserve them, to try and give them a second chance after more often than not they had failed to meet sales expectations and simply disappeared off the shelves. These days, in the age of digital distribution, that's less of a factor, but when I was much younger, I used that website regularly, and I was able to find some of my favorite games of all time, games like Sacrifice or Metal Fatigue, games that broke the mold, games that tried new and dangerous things, and frankly at the time were punished for doing so. When I started to get a following in podcasting and then a much larger following on YouTube, Livestream, Ustream, Justin TV, and then of course Twitch TV, I said to myself, I don't want that to happen again. If it's possible to stop that from happening, to be one of the people that allows these titles to breathe, that gives them the chance that they maybe otherwise would not have got through sheer marketing, brute force, then I should do that. I think that's a worthwhile goal. It's something worth pursuing. But as demonstrated time and again, you can't save them all. And it doesn't matter how good you think a game is if the game itself can't communicate at least a part of that without you helping it along. Invisigun was unfortunately a game that couldn't do that. It was a game that, through its own originality, shot itself in both knees and then potentially the head. Thankfully, it's come back. It's resurrected itself from the dead with this new spectator mode, and I'm hoping, genuinely hoping, that some people will give it another chance, that a few streamers might just try it out, because it is that enjoyable as a multiplayer experience. But it's quite likely they won't. And we might end up with a Game of the Year list with a game in it that has sold less than 10,000 units. It's a game that was kickstarted for a small amount of money. We don't know whether or not that was even enough to fund the entirety of the development, but it came out. They released it, and they released the game that their Kickstarter backers wanted. Unfortunately, it seems like anyone outside of that may very well have not been interested in the product. Our current Steam chart concurrent player base quite clearly shows that the game, despite receiving a boost after our Chrono GG promotion, currently has a concurrent player base of, well, 0. The peak in the last 24 hours was 13. The all-time peak for the game was 45. A Discord server exists in which you can organize games, and they're trying to organize a game night on a weekly basis to at least ensure that their very small community has a chance to continue to play. Maybe this is a game that was never going to survive on Steam. Maybe this is a game that was never going to survive on PC. Maybe this is a game that needs a Switch release. Perhaps that will give it the second, or in, I suppose, this case, third lease of life that it requires. But regardless of that, it stands as an example of something that may very well have been just a little bit too original for its own good. And the more original something is, the harder it is to communicate those ideas. And it's especially hard when you can't bloody see anything. It's an interesting comparison, really, to a video that I made back in 2015 called The Failure of an Indie Platformer, focusing on Airscape, a game by Cross Product that was simply okay. A game that just didn't really excel in all that many ways. Wasn't bad. It just didn't stand out and was unable to gather an audience around launch, even with the help of video makers like Jacksepticeye, who got the game over 1 million views. You know what's interesting about that, though? What's intriguing about Airscape is that while it had shifted around the time less than 1,000 copies, these days it sits on 375,000. What a strange situation. Reduced to the price of 49 cents, a game that quite literally only received YouTube coverage from 2 major channels, Jacksepticeye and myself. Airscape's failure turned itself into Airscape's success story. The story of its abject, dismal sales drove it into a state where, frankly, it has sales that are enviable by many indie developers. 375,000 units, according to Steam Spy. 1,654 positive reviews, according to Steam. A game that made so little impact on launch that you haven't even heard of any of the outlets that actually reviewed it for Metacritic. And yet right now, not too bad, eh? Maybe there is a life after death for these games after all. Whereas Airscape may very well have not deserved too much attention on launch, Invisigun certainly does, and, well, maybe its success is to be found at the 99-cent price point, or 50 cents, or even lower than that. Maybe that is the sad race to the bottom that we find ourselves in. Or maybe, now that viewers can see it for what it really is, it stands a chance of a second coming. I hope so. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there, and feel free to discuss this particular video in the official subreddit thread that has been linked in the comment section below. I'll see you next time.